The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to another edition of The Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. And Jacob, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I have to start by asking you the big question of the week, which I feel cannot be avoided, and which is this. Did Jackie Weaver have the authority to kick Brian Tolliver, chair of Handworth Parish Council, out of a Handforth Parish Council meeting on Zoom?
That's a very good question. I haven't looked up the standing orders of the Parish Council, but I think that she handled it as well as anybody could have been expected to handle a very tricky meeting.
You've seen the recording?
I have, yes, I have. It is very funny. And I think we've all been to meetings like that, haven't we, which end up discussing the protocol of the meeting and the rules of the meeting rather than getting on to the business that is meant to be at hand.
Did you find it, as I did, rather hard to work out what was actually happening beside the comedy of what was going on, and whether in fact she had any right to kick this bloke and two other blokes out of the meeting at all?
It was very unclear as to who was entitled to do what and what the meeting was aiming to do anyway. But I'm afraid lots of meetings up and down the country have been happening like this face-to-face over centuries. So I wouldn't worry too much. I once spent a very long time at a meeting that was discussing whether it was to be the committee or the provisional committee. And after about an hour, it still hadn't decided whether it was the committee or the provisional committee. Unfortunately, at that point, I had another engagement. So I don't think these things are atypical.
You weren't chairing that meeting?
No, I was not, I'm glad to say.
And you didn't have the power to kick anyone out?
I didn't have the power to kick anybody out.
And no one kicked you out? You left voluntarily?
Nobody kicked me out. I left of my own accord, yes. I was quite relieved to have another appointment to go to, I must confess.
All right, we'll move on from Jackie Weaver to quite a substantial issue for the government tomorrow. The China Genocide Amendment, as I think of it, is back. Could you, because you have to follow these things closely as Leader of the Commons, I'm mindful we're recording today as Monday, but listeners are hearing this Moggcast today, Tuesday. Could you explain what the Genocide Amendment is seeking to do and why the government's resisting it?
The Genocide Amendment is seeking to give the courts a role in deciding whether or not a country is guilty of genocide. And this is, on the face of it, not unreasonable, because the current situation is that the government will accept a definition of genocide if declared by an international court. But the international courts find that very difficult to do because, for example, China, which is where the whole row has erupted, is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and in other courts has to be a willing participant to the procedure, and therefore you can't have an international court that will do it, and therefore the argument has been, why not bring it to a domestic court? The problem with that, which is why the government is resisting it, is that our courts do not get involved in these type of discussions because there's no ability of the international government effectively to represent itself in our courts. The courts aren't there to, in the normal course of events, issue statements of fact. They're there to determine a case between two sides. And therefore, this is essentially a political decision, which is why the government is saying, and I think absolutely rightly, that this is a matter that should be decided by Parliament rather than by the courts. I mean, if you like, it should be the High Court of Parliament, as historically Parliament was, but a very different type of court from the High Court.
That's a change in the government's position, isn't it? The government's always said previously, and this goes for previous governments too, that genocide must be decided on by a court, not by legislators who vote.
The court that they were talking about were international courts, which are incapable of deciding these matters for China. So the people on the other side of this argument have quite rightly pointed out that that's a perfectly reasonable position when it relates to countries that are going to come before a court for whatever reason, but it isn't reasonable in relation to a country that is not under the jurisdiction of a court or will not agree to a court's considering its position. And that's why it's become a different situation in relation to China and the Uyghurs.
So the government's changed its view, or as you would probably put it, evolved its view since this amendment was last debated, or a similar amendment debated anyway, only a few weeks ago.
Not really. I think the government's consistent position has been that the decision on a trade agreement between the UK and any other country is essentially a political issue unless there is a judgment of an international court in relation to genocide, which is a very separate and high bar to reach, and that the decision by Parliament in relation to a genocide is not the same as a legal decision by an international court.
So if Parliament, for example, voted that China was committing genocide against the Uyghurs, would the government feel bound to act on Parliament's vote?
Well, I think this is a question of political reality, as always, isn't it? That the government is only the government because it commands a majority in the House of Commons, and that majority has confidence in it. I think the circumstances where a majority of Parliament felt that there was a genocide going on. I mean, this is not an unpleasant government behaving badly. This is a government that is seeking to wipe out a particular people. This is a very, very high bar. I think it, as a matter of political reality, would be something that no government would either want to or be able to ignore.
Let me just stand back from this for a moment. I mean, a few weeks ago, and I took some interest in what was going on, the campaigners put down an amendment that essentially said that the government must do what the courts say if it makes a genocide ruling. They've come back with an amendment that has a little bit more daylight. It simply says that the government must respond to the courts. My point really is this: the government only won by, I think it was fewer than 10, perhaps 9 votes last time. The government, unless it can find some ingenious compromise, may lose the vote today, Tuesday. Isn't it the case that the government's trade policy with China has traditionally pointed one way? The security policy is very rapidly pointing another, and that the government is being made to think and react on the hoof, not only by what China's doing to the Uyghurs, but also, of course, to what China's doing in Hong Kong. And it has to get its policy in coherent order quickly.
I think you're making a very important point, that our relationship with China is not what it was when George Osborne was Chancellor of the Exchequer and David Cameron was Prime Minister. The Chinese government's behaviour towards Hong Kong has broken the joint declaration. We are now dealing with a nation that we in good faith did a deal with, that it has decided not to continue with and not to continue in the spirit of, and has behaved in a way that is unreliable and is not active in good faith towards the agreement it made to preserve the rights of Hong Kong and the freedoms of Hong Kong for 50 years. And that has inevitably changed the relationship between the UK and China. It is a most serious issue, and that's why, quite rightly, the government is offering a route to full British citizenship for the British national overseas passport holders in Hong Kong. But you're absolutely right, that has changed the relationship, and what's been going on, the treatment of the Uyghurs, which we know more about, but includes things like enforced sterilizations, is shocking.
Just one further question on this. The debate today, Tuesday, is all about genocide in relation to a trade bill, and the peg that the campaigners have hung this amendment on is new trade deals. But actually, we haven't got a trade deal currently under negotiation with China, and it seems rather unlikely to. Big question hanging over all this is, how can we continue to trade normally with China, never mind new trade deals, given what's going on in Hong Kong and what's taking place with the Uyghurs?
I think what you're saying explains a fundamental point, that this is really not about so much the trade deal with China that doesn't exist, but is pressure being applied to the government to change its relationship with China more broadly. It's about the total relationship with China rather than specifically trade, and it is clearly about China rather than about any country in the world, an unknown country that might be guilty of genocide. That is also clearly true. There is always a tension in foreign affairs between realpolitik and human rights and morality. We find this with a number of our relationships, as you know, and as we may even have discussed before. But I think genocide really is in another category. It is something that is fundamentally evil. And if you associate yourself with evil, you become tainted by it. And therefore, we have to be extremely careful about the approach we take if a country were to be guilty of genocide.
Thank you. I want finally to ask you about issues that come out of a piece we ran on Conservative Home yesterday. That's Monday morning. Really, for us, it was a piece by a DUP MP, Sammy Wilson. Do you think of yourself as a friend of the DUP?
Yes, I do. I addressed the DUP a couple of years ago in Antrim, and I think as unionists we have a great deal in common.
Let me come to the substance of his article, which was based on a Brexit policy study report, Centre for Brexit Policy report. It came in the aftermath of the extraordinary business, which I don't think we've had a chance to speak about yet, of the EU temporarily blowing up the Northern Ireland Protocol and temporarily installing the hard border in Ireland that they had lectured first the May government and then the Johnson government about never imposing. We had all that. This hard border was momentarily imposed because of the EU's response to its failure over vaccines. And Sammy Wilson's argument this morning was, well, now that they've shown that they believe the protocol is in certain circumstances dispensable, now's the time for us to get rid of it completely ourselves and to solve all these problems about checks on goods going from Great Britain into Northern Ireland.
I think that the use of Article 16 by the European Union shows that Article 16 is there to be used. And there would have been arguments beforehand about whether it was practical to use it, whether it was in the spirit of agreement to use it. But the use of it, albeit briefly, indicates that it is there to be used and that it would be reasonable to use it in circumstances provided for by the agreement, and that we need to ensure that there is the free flow of goods between GB and Northern Ireland. Not only did we commit to it electorally in the UK, but it's the agreement we have with the European Union that we will only stop goods going to Northern Ireland that are at risk of going into the Republic of Ireland and into the single market. Will help the EU protect its single market. But it seems unlikely that that includes tractors that are going into Northern Ireland from Great Britain that have a little bit of British soil on their wheels. And we've got to ensure that the agreement is properly implemented and does not frustrate trade. And if that doesn't work, then we must look at the other options. As the Prime Minister has made absolutely clear, Northern Ireland is a central part of the United Kingdom. And we agreed with the EU that Northern Ireland would be in the UK's regulatory ambit and its customs ambit, as well as having rights in relation to the European Union, and that we would help protect the European Union, but not at the expense of undermining the fundamental unity of the United Kingdom.
So, in short, if in Michael Gove's negotiations for It Is He with the EU, if they don't produce this free flow of trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, we should invoke Article 16 and effectively suspend the protocol.
Well, the Prime Minister has raised that possibility himself, and his words are much more authoritative than mine, and that the EU, by invoking Article 16, has clearly indicated that it is there to be used if necessary.
Just a final question for the day. Although there's a lot I could ask about the coronavirus, we've been round that particular subject many times. So I'm just going to ask you, what's your feeling for where we are now on opening up again? And if it's the case that we're not going to return to a tiering system, but we're all going to move together in one step to get out of lockdown, doesn't that suggest that, on the balance of things, we'll be a bit slower to get out of lockdown rather than a bit quicker? Because we'll have to wait for the slowest passenger in the convoy.
Well, I think one of the key things about the whole process is that it's always operated with the consent of the British people. It hasn't been the government high-handedly imposing restrictions. It's been clear that the British people were willing to have the restrictions and to follow them. And as we come out of this, it will be with the consent and through the consent of the British people, who will, I expect, want to have their freedoms restored to them as soon as is practicable. And so I think as the death rate continues to fall and the infection rate continues to fall, there will be a bottom-up demand to restore freedoms, which the government will inevitably be influenced by, because it was influenced by the desire of people to have the restrictions placed on in the first place. So I think the pace will be one that the country is comfortable with. If that's not avoiding your question, it's simply indicating it's quite difficult to predict precisely what that will be. But it requires consent. It's really important, in my view, to remember that all of this has happened with consent rather than by compulsion.
Well, of course, that's been your leitmotif throughout all these conversations about the coronavirus. And we'll leave it there. No doubt we'll return to the subject when we speak again in a fortnight's time. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. In a fortnight's time, we will know more about where the restrictions are going, because that's the date the roadmap is, I believe, going to be set out. We may even be allowed to meet face-to-face, which would be nice.
It would indeed. Thank you very much.
Bye.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.